about Brazilian history. The bits that I know about are only really the bits relating to Japan and how judo came over and how Brazilian jiu-jitsu was made, because I did Brazilian jiu-jitsu for a few years. Okay, well, I hope that you can strap in and enjoy this whispering video. If you have something you want me to read about, please leave it in the comments below. I'm sorry if you can hear a high-pitched whirring air conditioner-like sound. My neighbour's air conditioner's unit is turned on, and sadly there's not anything I can do about it, but I'll try and fix it in post as much as I can. Okay. Feel free to leave a comment and say hello as well, because I love seeing who's watching the videos. Now, Brazil as an independent empire. Tensions between Portuguese and Brazilians increased, and the Portuguese courts, or cortes, guided by the new political regime imposed by the 1820 liberal revolution, tried to re-establish Brazil as a colony. The Brazilians refused to yield, and Prince Pedro decided to stand with them, declaring the country's independence from Portugal. On the 7th of September 1822, a month later, Prince Pedro was declared the first emperor of Brazil, with the royal title of Dom Pedro I, resulting in the foundation of the Empire of Brazil. The Brazilian War of Independence, which had already begun along this process, spread through the northern, northeastern regions and in Cisplatina province. The last Portuguese soldiers surrendered on the 8th of March 1824. Portugal officially recognized Brazil on the 29th of August 1825. On the 7th of April 1831, worn down by years of administrative turmoil and political dissent, with both liberal and conservative sides of politics, including an attempt of republican succession, and unreconciled to the way that absolutists in Portugal had given in the succession of King John VI, Pedro I went to Portugal to reclaim his daughter's crown, abdicating the Brazilian throne in favour of his 5-year-old son and heir, who thus became the empire's second monarch, with the royal title of Dom Pedro II. As the new emperor could not exert his constitutional powers until he came of age, a regency was set up by the National Assembly, in the absence of a charismatic figure who could represent a moderate face of power. During this period, a series of localized rebellions took place, such as the Cabinagam in Guarapara province, the Malay Revolt in Salvador de Bahia, the Baleada, I'm so sorry, the Sabinada, and the Ragamuffin War, which began in Rio Grande do Sul, and was supported by Giuseppe Garibaldi. These emerged from as a result of the British Aberdeen Act, but only in May of 1888, after a long process of internal mobilisation and debate for an ethical and legal dismantling of slavery in the country, was the institution formally abolished. The foreign affairs policies of the monarch dealt with issues with the countries of the Southern Cone, with whom Brazil had borders. Long after the Cisplatin War that resulted in independence for Uruguay, Brazil had won 3 international wars during the 58-year reign of Patron II. These were the Platine Wars, the Uruguayan War, and the devastating Paraguayan War, the largest war effort in Brazilian history. Although there was no desire among the majority of Brazilians to change the country's form of government, on the 15th of November 1889, in disagreement with the majority of army officers as well as the rural and financial elites for different reasons, the monarchy was overthrown by a military coup on the 15th of November. Is now a Republic Day, which is a national holiday in Brazil. Okay, wait a minute. So, most Brazilians didn't care, but they still had a military coup anyway. I don't get what's the point of that. Weird. Now we move to the early Republic. The early Republican government was nothing more than a military dictatorship, with army dominating affairs both in Rio de Janeiro and in the States. Freedom of the press disappeared and elections were controlled by those in power. Not until 1894, following an economic crisis and a military one, did civilians take power, remaining there until October of 1930. If, in relation to its foreign policy, the country in its first Republican period maintained a relative balance, characterized by success in resolving border disputes with neighbouring countries, only broken by the Acre War and its involvement in World War I, followed by a failed attempt to exert a prominent role in the League of Nations internally from the crisis of Isolamento and the Armada revolts. A prolonged cycle of financial, political and social instability began in the 1920s, keeping the country besieged by various rebellions, both civil and military. Okay. Little by little, a cycle of general instability sparked by these crises undermined the regime to such an extent that in the wake of the murder of his running mate, the defeated opposition presidential candidate Getulio Vargas, supported by most of the military, successfully led the 1930s coup. Vargas and the military were supposed to assume power temporarily, but instead closed the Congress, extinguished the Constitution, ruled with emergency powers, and replaced the state governors with their own supporters. Oh, Brazil. What a dramatic history you have. In the 1930s, 3 failed attempts to remove Vargas and his supporters from power occurred. The first was the Constitutionalist Revolution in 1932, led by the Paulista oligarchy. The second was a communist uprising in November of 1935, and the last one, a pushed attempt by local fascists in May of 1938. The 1935 uprising created a security crisis in which the Congress transferred more power to the executive. The 1937 coup d'etat resulted in the cancellation of the 1938 regimes in Europe, Vargas's position became unsustainable, and he was swiftly overthrown in another military coup, with democracy reinstated by the same army that had ended it 15 years earlier. Vargas committed suicide in August of 1954 amid a political crisis after having returned to power by election in 1950. Now we're moving into the contemporary era of Brazil. Several brief interim governments followed Vargas's suicide. Juscelino Kubitschek became president in 1956 and assumed a conciliatory posture towards the political opposition that allowed him to govern without major crisis. The economy and industrial sector grew remarkably, but his greatest achievement was construction of the new capital city of Brasilia, inaugurated in 1960. Wow, so Brasilia is like a new city. Kubitschek's successor, Jânio Quadros, resigned in 1961, less than a year after taking office. Sounds like what happens in Australia. His vice president, João Goulart, assumed the presidency, but aroused strong political opposition and was deposed in April of 1964 by a coup that resulted in a military regime. Brazil, what are you doing? Stop having these regimes. The new regime was intended to be transitory, but gradually closed in on itself and became a full dictatorship with the promulgation of the Fifth Institutional Act in 1968. With revolutions, this seems to be how it goes. Oppression was not limited to those who resorted to guerrilla tactics to fight the regime, but also reached institutional opponents, artists, journalists, and other members of civil society, inside and outside the country through the infamous Operation Condor. Despite its brutality, like other authoritarian regimes, due to an economic boom known as an economic miracle, the regime reached a peak of popularity in the early 1970s. Slowly, however, the wear and tear of years of dictatorial power that had not slowed the repression, even after the defeat of the leftist guerrillas, plus the inability to deal with the economic crises of the period and popular pressure, made an opening policy inevitable, which, from the regime side, was led by generalist Ernesto Geisel and Golbery de Couto Silva. With the enactment of the amnesty law in 1979, Brazil began a slow return to democracy, which was completed during the 1980s. Civilians returned to power in 1985, when José Sarney assumed the presidency. He became unpopular during his tenure through failure to control the economic crisis and hyperinflation he inherited from the military regime. Sarney's unsuccessful government led to the election in 1989 of the almost unknown Fernando Collor, subsequently impeached by the National Congress in 1992. Collor was succeeded by his vice president, Itamar Franco, who appointed Fernando Henrique Cardoso Minister of France. In 1994, Cardoso produced a highly successful Plano Real that, after decades of failed economic plans made by previous governments attempting to curb hyperinflation, finally stabilized the Brazilian economy. Cardoso won the 1994 election and again in 1998. was seen as the proof that Brazil had achieved a long-sought political stability. However, sparked by indignation and frustrations accumulated over decades from corruption, police brutality, inefficiencies of the political establishment and public service, numerous peaceful protests erupted in Brazil from the middle of the first term of Dilma Rousseff, who had succeeded Lula after winning the elections in 2010 and again in 2014 by narrow margins. Rousseff was impeached by the Brazilian Congress in 2016, halfway into her second term. What a complicated history, and replaced by her Vice President Michael Temer, who assumed full presidential powers after Rousseff's impeachment was accepted on the 31st of August. Large street protests for and against her took place during the impeachment process. The charges against her were fueled by political and economic crises, along with evidence of involvement with politicians from all the primary political parties in several bribery and tax evasion schemes. In 2017, the Supreme Court requested the investigation of 71 Brazilian lawmakers and 9 ministers of President Michael Temer's cabinet who were allegedly linked to Petrobras corruption scandal. President Temer himself was also accused of corruption. According to a 2018 poll, 62% of the population said that corruption was Brazil's biggest problem. Through the Operation Car Wash, the Federal Police of Brazil has since acted on the deviations and corruptions of the PT and allied parties at that time. What a weird name, Operation Car Wash. Well, I'm glad that they've put some work in. In the fiercely disputed 2018 elections, the controversial conservative candidate Jair Bolsonaro of the Social Liberal Party was elected president, winning in the secondary round. Fernando Haddad of the Workers' Party, with the support of 55.13% of the valid votes. Interesting. I don't sadly know enough about Brazil, but honestly, I don't want to offend anyone, but Bolsonaro seems insane. All of the things that I've seen on the news, or at least reported in Australian television about Bolsonaro, like quotes and direct translations of things that he said in speeches, seem insane to me. They seem like sexist and racist and homophobic. And it's kind of crazy. And his comments about the coronavirus were also insane. It didn't seem like they did a very good job at managing the coronavirus, actually. So, I'm always worried about you, my lovely friends down in Brazil. I hope that your government is taking care of you, or that perhaps it's changing for the better and your people are getting taken care of. Thank you so much for joining me for another video. I love learning new things, and I love spending time with all of you, helping you all relax and have an amazing